Hi,
Hi.
Jack.
Hi,
Hi,
Jack.
how's it
Welcome.
going?
Thanks so much
Hello.
for accepting our invitation to be here.
Thank you for asking me, and lovely to meet you all.
So welcome everyone to another session of our Poets Talk Politics series here at the Comparative Literature Institute at the University of Porto. And this is going to be the final session in our new poetry scholarship interlude. So when we come back from summer break, we're going to keep talking to poets as we were doing before. And so today we have Jack Parlett, who is the author of the Poetics of Cruising, Queer Visual Culture from Whitman to Grindr. So thank you very much for coming, Jack. I'm just going to introduce everyone else on the panel very briefly, and then I'm going to introduce you more, in depth. I am a full-time researcher here at the Comparative Literature Institute. I specialize on contemporary American poetry and science studies. And then we have Elina Siltanen, who is a university lecturer at the University of Turku in Finland. She's also an Americanist like myself, also works on contemporary American poetry and has worked recently on such things as affect theory, confessionalism, new sincerity, and now I believe is more leaning towards eco-criticism in her most recent projects. And then Inês Cardoso is a PhD student at the University of Porto in the PhD in intermedia studies. She is a specialist in contemporary Portuguese poetry, in particular of the experimental persuasion. She's very, very interested in very obscure and weird stuff. And she's going to defend her dissertation very soon. So that's going to be fun. And then finally, we have a student of mine, an MA student in the master's in intermedia studies here at the university as well. He's interested in film studies, classical literature, and intermedia studies. So welcome everyone. I'm just going to very briefly introduce Jack. And so Jack, I'm just going to read from the about section that you have on your website. So Jack Parlett is a writer, poet, and scholar. He's the author of 3 books: Fire Island, Love, Loss, and Liberation in an American Paradise; The Poetics of Cruising, Queer Visual Culture from Whitman to Grindr, which came out from the University of Minnesota Press. That's the book that we're going to be talking about. And Same Blue, Different You, which is a poetry pamphlet. Fire Island was named an editor's pick by the New York Times and one of the best books of 2022 by the New Yorker and BBC Culture. So congratulations for that. His writing has appeared in the New Yorker, Boston Review, Grant Literary Hub, BBC Culture, Poetry London, and elsewhere. So again, thank you very much for being here, Jack.
Thank you for having me, and lovely to meet all of you as well. I'm excited for our conversation this evening.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I normally, as I was telling everyone before you got here, I normally let other people ask the first question, but since I know that my fellow panelists have more specific questions to ask you, I'm just going to, maybe ask you to maybe expand upon, discuss this very counterintuitive, I think, idea that the whole project revolves around, which is that, looking and, cruising, gazing can have like a political utopian, interpersonal potential, right? So you can create this sort of interpersonal feeling by gazing at other people that they are mostly strangers, right? Which is so I find this maybe the most the example that you use throughout the book that's most revealing, or that condenses the idea the best, I believe, is maybe Langston uses subway face, that I think Elina also wants to talk about, right? So this idea that I've been looking for you all my life, and yet the person that I'm looking at, right, doesn't, none of this really matters to the person, right? So this idea that that there's some sort of affect that can be created through looking at a stranger, right, I believe is very much at the base of all of the chapters throughout the book, right? And this idea also of an unrealized past or future, right, that you could have built, or that you could build with this stranger that you meet on a train or on a dating app or whatever, right? So that's pretty, as I was saying, counterintuitive, and not exactly the way we've been thinking about the gaze. So maybe if you want to expand on that.
Right. Well, I think, as you say, like, there's something counterintuitive about those relationships between like an unrealized past or a possible future, between gazing versus looking. And I think, like, an idea that's often felt helpful to me in trying to think this through is sort of the idea of being suspended, I suppose, right? That the act of looking, or the moment of encounter, like, what's going on there? Like, what is producing that kind of affective surplus? Is it being suspended between possible temporalities, or like even identities, right? Like, I feel like what can also be happening in that moment of encounter is the creation of another in your own eyes, but also a kind of rethinking of yourself. And I think that that's something that's happening in a poem like Subway Face in the Langston Hughes, and also in earlier texts and in Whitman. I think that was sort of how I found my way through this material, was thinking about the fact that, like, these moments are both, at least in the literary works that I've been concerned with, like, moments of high drama, right? They're moments of, like, high drama, heightened feeling, heightened expression. And yet, like, for anyone who sort of lives in a city or is familiar with what it's like to live in a city, they are simultaneously transient and kind of temporary, and, like, might happen several times within an hour, never mind within a day. And so I think it was that friction that really interested me about what these encounters might be, that they can be both kind of everything and nothing. And I think, I became interested in them in part because I've always found those, in my own life, those moments of encounter and not just in cities, but in public space, to be completely fascinating and kind of charged, and sometimes erotically charged. But I suppose how this mapped out onto a queer history was what interested me. Like, to think that the look as a unit of time and sort of space and of perception might actually have, fulfilled a crucially important function in the sort of creation of, like, queer subterranean spaces in cities. So I think really what drew me to this concept. I think it's worth saying there too that perhaps there's a distinction to be drawn between looking and gazing, right? As you say, like, partly what feels counterintuitive here is the idea that we're so used to thinking of the gaze as almost as something kind of from without or from a distance. It presumes a power relationship, and that we are not implicated by our own gaze. But I mean, often in a cruising encounter, we are both the subject and object of somebody else's gaze, of somebody else's look. So looking, for me, I think, takes on a slightly more reciprocal and active dimension. It's, of course, totally possible to gaze upon somebody in a space like this, or to be a sort of voyeur. But I think largely the encounters that I became interested in as having this, like, holding this sort of interpersonal democratic potential, were to do with reciprocity of seeing and being seen simultaneously.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much. Elina, do you want to maybe tie in your question about the poem to mine?
Yeah, okay. So while we're on the topic of Hughes's Subway Face, I wanted to ask about what kinds of resonances the kinds of cruising poems you discuss have in contemporary times and in contemporary poetry. I mean, I know you write about Grindr and Eileen Myles, but I was thinking about this particularly when reading you're discussing a subway face, and that's described as having a contemporary urban feel and as capturing the irretrievable as a condition of the urban everyday. And that poem, of course, it's from the 1920s. And it made me think of an Instagram account I once saw, which is called Hot Dudes Reading, where someone takes candid photos of men reading books on the subway, which is in some ways a project that has a similar sensibility in a way, but it is probably less melancholic. And then later in the book, you do discuss Eileen Miles's poems, which also reference the subway, but as your discussion indicates, Fair Work seems to address somewhat different issues, often focusing on exclusion and representation. So it seems to me that you discuss contemporary poetry and culture mostly as something that perhaps focuses on different issues. So would you say that this kind of urban anonymity and irretrievability that we find in subway face is something particular to perhaps older texts, or is there something in contemporary poetry or culture that might resonate with this?
I think firstly, thank you for bringing my attention to that Instagram account, which I did not know before, and I think is fascinating. And they're great pictures. I mean, I think I can't readily think of lots of examples that quite give voice, if we're thinking of subway face in particular, to the particular melancholy that I think animates that poem. I think there are multiple reasons for that, right? And partly it's because the photographs of hot guys reading on the subway, they're not, they may share a sensibility with a poem like Hughes's, but ultimately what they're attesting to is something that has been retrieved, right? That's something that has been immortalized. I think often many of these poems that I think yearn for strangers are also yearning for the act of representation, of capturing a moment that might otherwise just pass by. And I think the proliferation of images in an account like that is itself a testament to the fact that these things are remembered and disseminated and traced in a different way. I think, I also think that thinking about dating apps and hookup apps necessarily changes in a way the narrative around transient encounters as irretrievable. I mean, on top of apps like Grindr, I mean, there are dating apps. I now can't remember what it was called, but a friend of mine was telling me about one that that can kind of trace whether you might have passed by someone that day in a city. And so it can even provide a kind of mechanism for finding, the mythologized one that you may have passed. And so I think really the terms of public intimacy like that have changed. And so, yeah, I think that there's a certain myth around the romance of the chance encounter that is absolutely still pervasive, and I think will always be of concern to writers in some ways. But I suppose the utility of these things has changed, right? And that the way that people might encounter someone in a sort of contingent and random way and then never again, that has a very different structure now. And so I think yeah, that much has changed since the time of Hughes's poem, and conversely sort of the sensibility or the kind of affective texture of it too. It's sort of less melancholic and more something that is sort of navigated through the virtual, for better or worse, right? I think I'm kind of ambivalent about what that means for how we think about public intimacy, but I do think it's sort of slightly taken the sting out of the notion of the one that got away, right?
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Inês, do you want to ask your question?
The next question. First of all, Jack, thank you for the reflections you included in this book. It was definitely one of the most interesting I read so far this year. So the first question I would like to make actually concerns one passage from the introduction, and I will read it very briefly because it might be useful for those watching us. So at a certain point, you write, the cruising works I am concerned with solicit a kind of reading that flouts any such fixed line between text and context. their erotics depend on a closeness to form that is simultaneous with attending to the particulars of their production and to the circumstances of their authors' lived experiences as cruisers of the city. So, of course, my question might be influenced by some readings I've been doing in the last few months. I've been reading a lot of Kathy Hacker and Mackenzie Ward, and I was wondering, bearing in mind what you said, how do you perceive questions like the death of the author in the works you summon? Do you think it's possible when we are talking about cruising, love, eroticism, sex, etc., to think of a certain object as queer on itself? I mean, when you blur the boundaries between poetry and photography, essay and fiction, do you believe it's possible to actually kill the figure of the author?
I think that's such an interesting way of thinking about some of those blurrings. I think in part because like some of the earlier texts that I think that I look at in the book, and that I suppose in some ways provide almost like a prehistory of what we call cruising. I'm thinking like in part of Whitman's poetry. I mean, in those texts, like they are utterances that are often ambiguous with regards to address and with regards to gender, right? Like I guess what I'm saying is that the author feels quite easy to kill in that in that context, because the way that they're written, I think, or the way that they make themselves available to different kind of voicings or different like attributions, like suggest a way of thinking about intimacy that's kind of universalized in a way that like we can read as queer because it feels furtive. But yeah, I think for me, in terms of like where these figures reside, like there's something about the material realities of what queer culture looked like at different historical moments that was really important to me, that in zooming in upon the poem as an utterance, that we also need to be paying attention to like how these acts of looking, or like even these acts of address, are kind of coded culturally. So I think I probably remain quite attached to the author in this model of reading, right? Like and almost kind of need them as the cruiser extraordinaire through some of this historical terrain. But I think, you know, similarly, like taking a sort of trans-historical approach, I guess I was also trying to think about cruising as something that like doesn't really fit into a neat linear history. I mean, there's even an argument against calling the intimacies that we find in 19th century texts to be cruising per se, right? If we're thinking in terms of like the propriety of when a term is being historically used. And so I think in some ways, like a kind of looseness with like how we're thinking about language and authorship can be quite helpful in some ways for thinking about like cruising as a sort of queer concept that actually traverses historical periods and may even have earlier prehistories than, you know, the ones that I've kind of concerned myself with.
Thank you.
Now, Vítor.
Hi, first and foremost. One thing that interests me personally has to do with the representation of the ill, fragile, or dead body, and I was, of course, particularly taken by the chapter on David Wojnarowicz and his work. So I suppose I should ask this question first, as it's also a little bit more general than the rest of them. But about that particular chapter, do you believe there to be erotic connotations or elements to the representation of ill bodies in the context of the LGBT community? Or, since I suppose that question might be a bit pointed and hard to discuss, do you at least perceive any continuities or similarities between the ways dead and sick bodies are artistically represented and the way especially gay men's bodies are often eroticized in different media? Because it definitely happens, as you aptly mentioned, with Wojnarowicz, but I just wanted to get your input on the pervasiveness of this possible relationship, as it seems to me it might be more prevalent than one might initially think, especially with the AIDS crisis having, of course, been a rather important part of LGBT history.
yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I think, as you say, it can feel like pointed or hard to talk about, or like even taboo to think about the erotics of the dying body. I mean, I think that's absolutely there in Wojnarowicz's writing, and in particular his writing about taking pictures of Peter Hujar, his lover, just after he died, and kind of enumerating his body parts and like celebrating the things. You know, he has these lines about his amazing feet, that there's absolutely something about a kind of shared erotic intimacy in death that I think has to do with like the way that intimacy is politicized in this period too, that you know, contrary to like some of the discourses, particularly during the mid to late 1980s, that are casting sex itself as dangerous, I feel like the celebration of safe sex practices absolutely informs the sense, a kind of reevaluation of what can be erotic or what can be considered erotic, right, in terms of like contact between partners and what intimacy looks like. And so I think that is pervasive in writing in this period, and it's certainly there in Wojnarowicz's work, like the sense that the ill body doesn't suddenly lose its erotic potential, and in fact, like there's actually a political function in continuing the sort of eroticize intimacies between people in that kind of in a crisis. I mean, I think like just as a broader reflection, like I think often of the sort of proximity between the way that bodies are represented and eroticized, and also kind of made into sort of saintly or even Christ-like figures. Like I'm thinking in particular of the very controversial Benetton ad in the 1990s that featured a gay man dying of AIDS surrounded by his family, who he essentially becomes a kind of Christ-like figure. That there are many moments, I think, when the dying body is aestheticized, right? And that serves different political functions, like it's a kind of a sanctifying or an elevating. And so I think like there's always a negotiation between those things, and that like a lot of the visual art that's coming out of this period, and also in the literature, and it's thorny territory, but I think it's something that Wojnarowicz is really concerned with. Thank you.
So Jack, my next question is I think sort of two-pronged, right? Like I wanted to ask you about at the same time this dimension of the trashiness of cruising, right? Because that seems to be something that you take pains to I believe in many of the chapters, I think, to make us see that that's an element, right? Like the people going to the docks, or getting away from the bar scene or whatever, right? The more bourgeois, protective, safe space in which middle class people can enter, and mostly white people can interact, right? And you make us focus on these like more murkier spaces or whatever, right? And so, and there's I call it, like in the email I sent to you, like the ecological aspect of also cruising, right? Like so this trashy dimension, right? And also but also and this is something I believe you see as positive, right? That's a positive democratic dimension of cruising, right? But then you also focus on how a lot of people are excluded from this activity of cruising, of browsing through potential partners, right? So you not only focus on how like women and non-binary people are many times not really part of this sort of scene. And for example, in the last chapter, you spend some time on how Grindr itself also excludes based on race, for example, right? And class and whatnot, right? And how like a poem that you close read by Dana Smith focuses on this issue of like how, Black people, for example, are more vulnerable to precisely to, AIDS and, other illnesses and whatnot, right? And how, so cruising has this darker, more, trashy side, but not as positive as the other, I guess, dimension that I foregrounded first. So, I mean, yeah. Maybe comment on those two things.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the definition of what trashy means like really matters, right? Like, as in, I think there's a sense that the piers, in the kind of way that New York in the 70s is often imagined, like the piers are like simultaneously a ruin and a kind of temple for a queer community cruising, which I think, like many of the narratives, I'm thinking of like Jonathan Weinberg's book about the piers, a sort of art history of the piers, that it's very easy to sort of be nostalgic about them as supposedly non-hierarchical spaces. I mean, they were, as any cruising space sort of is, they were hierarchical in certain ways, but they did provide like a certain kind of reprieve or an alternative to the bar scene and to the kind of like largely bourgeois West Village bar scene. I mean, I think that the ecological aspect is really important. The piers provide that in a sense, and I think it's something that I've thought about in my own work on Fire Island, which is like a space related to New York. It's like, not very far away. It's like 50 miles away, but it's essentially a sort of sandbar off the Long Island coast, where the cruising area on Fire Island is known as the Meat Rack, which is like a thick wooded area between the two queer communities on the island that, like, to cruise outdoors, like in a kind of space outside the city, is also to be attuned to the ecological sort of specificities of a place. I mean, there's been some interesting work and activism on Fire Island recently. Like, there's a research collective called the Institute of Queer Ecology, who sort of did a kind of a walk through the Meat Rack, thinking about cruising from an ecological perspective. And and for me, I think there's a kind of shared aim between what cruising can or might be and what a kind of ecologically minded navigation of space can be, which is to try and unpick some of those hierarchies, right? To kind of remain alive to contingency, and not to kind of merely name or taxonomize or other what we see around us, or to kind of place like ourselves as a central subject of perception. So I think cruising has a kind of, there are like meaningful distinctions, comparisons, to draw with a kind of ecological practice, and the piers represent that. But would you mind explaining just the second part of your question about trashiness in relation to those that are excluded? Because I think I slightly. So
what I was thinking. So I was thinking in particular about Heather Love's looking backwards, and how, the work that she's done, for example, on this, I guess, darker dimension of queer studies, right? Because we tend to think about queer studies as being about, empowerment and, giving people rights and, making people visible, right? And I think her focus on, in that book is on how even that sort of rhetoric and that sort of logic ends up excluding, all of these people with disabilities or unattractive. So for example, I believe in the chat. I mean, you go back to, I believe, this topic a few times, right? Like how people that are just not unattractive for several reasons, I guess, right? So they're not part of the scene, right? Because even on Grindr, right? The white person, right? The white bourgeois person still has some sort of privilege, right? And you tend to see that as being, or again, like the space of the peers, the docs, and whatever, is being more democratic, right? As being, being more maybe allowing for, these differences to not matter as much or whatever, for a queer space to be truly maybe inclusive or democratic and not just, positive, right? In that more like,
well, and also I think crucially public, right? I think that's an important distinction in all of this, that And that's why the subway, I know we've already talked about the subway, but why it's a locus that crops up, like, I think, you know, many times in the history of cruising as a space of like social, and like in the context of what Hughes is writing about, social and racial mixing, that like the subway is a space in which that happens, as are parks, right, that are crucially important, and parks being kind of urban and pastoral at the same time, that they're both of those things. So I think like partly this question of cruising spaces that are, you know, more inclusive of those who have been historically excluded, like the public nature of that really matters. And I guess one of the arguments against an app like Grindr is that it risks privatizing public space in some way, or allowing people to express or act upon their preferences in a way that you know, ultimately narrows their focus, or kind of narrows the way in which they're engaging with a sort of virtual space. I think that there's also a question with apps like Grindr about whether they are exacerbating pre-existing problems around the sort of social hierarchies that exist within a practice like cruising, or have done historically, or whether it's creating new ones. I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, but I think certainly Grindr has coaxed out and made explicit prejudices that might have remained unspoken in other kinds of contexts. I think that's really an important thing to acknowledge about it. But yeah, I think that I focused in the book, I suppose, upon cruising public space as something that continues to hold this potential. And it's not that it always, or even often, can realize that utopian potential. But it's in that space that potential resides. I think that it's sort of outside of the realm in which it depends upon somebody buying you a drink or you paying cover to get into the bar, right? Like outside of that kind of class conscious space.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, Elina.
Yeah. So my other question is about the sense of community, or poetics of cruising as community building, which I believe is an idea that does come up in your book every once in a while, even if it's not always explicit. So you write, for example, about the address to a you in Whitman's poetry, like in To Those or One Who Will Understand, which seems like a poem that invites the reader to be a part of the community that includes the text and the poem speaker and the reader. And I would be curious to know whether you think similar moments can be found, for example, in Frank O'Hara's work with regard to community building. Because, well, O'Hara in particular is known as someone who name drops a lot, and he writes about what he sees and observes, which in a sense is kind of self-indulgent, if you want to put it that way. These are the things that he knows and is familiar with. So where does that kind of writing leave readers? Do they have possibilities of feeling included in this community through reading his poetry? Is there perhaps a difference from Whitman? And perhaps on a more general level, is this something that changes? Are such utopic possibilities of community building more difficult later on? I guess you already kind of brought this in your previous answer when you said something about Grindr maybe privatizing things. But if we think more specifically about O'Hara, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that community is sort of everywhere in Whitman, precisely because it feels sort of intangible, right? Like the notion of a queer community in Whitman's writing is always something that's being projected or imagined as he puts it, this mode of adhesiveness between comrades. And so often it's the kind of utopian imaginary rather than like something rooted in the realities of life in the city, although these intimacies go some way to providing that, I suppose, or enacting that in moments. I think O'Hara's relationship to community and to queer community, I think, is fascinating, in part because, as you say, like he's often celebrated or, you know, at least discussed as the coterie poet and the poet who knows everyone and lets us know about that as readers. And I mean, I think that that as a gesture can simultaneously be a kind of excluding, right? Like a pushing away of a reader and inviting into a world. It depends upon, I think, our sensibilities as readers. I think this is going back to the question of the death of the author, right? Of how much are we looking to excavate the biographies of these writers? But I think that O'Hara as gay poet, as queer poet, was like, I think, quite frosty towards liberation projects, at least explicitly. And I think, you know, when I think about his cruisiest poem, I think is his cruisiest poem in some ways, in that it homosexuality, which sort of name checks the public bathrooms of the latrines of New York. I think that poem is sort of is like relatively nonplussed about the possibility that these encounters might be forms of community building. Like I think O'Hara is an interestingly obstinate figure in that way, that he kind of imagines, like many of his poems imagine forms of like intimacy and togetherness in like very beautiful ways. But I think that he as a figure, I think, was not particularly compelled to see this in a kind of larger political context. And I think that may have some part to do with where things sit historically. I mean, one of those differences, I think, is to do with like a kind of utopian imaginary in Whitman's writing versus the like pockets of subterranean queer culture that exist in O'Hara's New York. But I mean, what's changed in that time is like massive, right? There's so much that's changed historically. And in part, I think the kind of unexpected flowering of a queer culture in New York in the 20s and early 30s that then is forced underground and hidden away. Like by the time we're in O'Hara's New York of the 50s and 60s, I think that there's, you know, like these very sort of shaming and toxic discourses are kind of alive and well. And I think that O'Hara as figure is sort of protected by his social status, that like coterie is a form of like artistic belonging, but it's also a kind of queer belonging, right? But I think that question of readerly intimacy, you know, I think that Whitman and O'Hara share that. I mean, there are many poems that are addressed to indeterminate use that I think are still, if we were to think about cruising as something that a writer does to a reader, I think that they both perform that in sort of comparable ways. And so I think in the way that they might kind of seek to conjure a community of readers, I think that they have something in common.
Thank you, Jack. Inês?
Yeah, this might go back to João Paulo's first question in a way. I was thinking about the last chapter when you discuss apps like Grindr, Tinder, etc. I would like to know, what do you think about the possibility of subverting those apps, their predictable function, and creating in and with those apps? Because I thought it was very interesting how you propose that we must interrogate where a critique of the present ends and the nostalgia for an imagined past begins. And of course, we know these apps can tell us a lot of how our oppressive, heteronormative capitalist society works. But like you say, it's obvious that there is a space for ambivalence, right? Like you were saying before. So if we consider the Poetics of Cruising as a political gesture, do you think we can expect to see more and more poets nowadays subverting these apps, subverting their capitalist and eventually objectifying nature, and by that turning them into an act of political resistance, an act of empowerment?
I think so. I mean, I think that the category of like the Grindr poem, for example, is like a growing one. And I think that like the poems that I look at right at the end of the book are just like some examples of that. And I think, like, for one, I think, you know, I guess part of my argument is that poetry has always provided a really important form for reflecting on what cruising is or what it might be. And that continues to be true in the way that poets are reckoning with Grindr, and in particular reckoning with the language of Grindr, and taking issue, I think, in part with the fact that much of it is kind of non-verbal, right? Or that the language is pared back to its barest form as a kind of expediency for sexual intimacy. And so I feel that, like, you know, poets are addressing are addressing sort of virtual intimacies in like very playful and like subversive ways, as you say. I think, you know, I think that these apps are, like, as you say, they reveal the sort of fissures of a kind of capitalistic and often exclusionary mode of like community. But I also think that they are not only that, right? And they also fulfill important functions, I think, for like people who are seeking intimacies discreetly for whatever reasons, like people who are closeted, who are like living in like less kind of densely populated and sort of like historically queer areas and metropolitan centers and cities. So I think these apps like contain within them, along with the potential to completely reveal like the bad stuff, they also contain within them the kind of potential for organizing and for like providing important forms of community for people who like maybe don't have easy access to it otherwise. So I think, yeah, I think it's often less about, you know, doing away with what these apps are than, as you say, subverting them, right? And I think that like these writers are doing that in some ways, and I think that like so much of the writing about Grindr, literary, academic, personal, I think gives voice to this feeling that like many of the people who are deeply suspicious of what it does and is doing to the way that we relate to each other also still use it. Like I would count myself in that category. Like that is the sort of nature of the beast, and it is ultimately the way that people are connecting. And so I think it's less about sort of like abandoning it than retaining a critical relationship to it that can kind of like change how we're behaving with each other.
Vítor?
Since we're on the topic of apps, with regard to Grindr, you mentioned the use of body part photographs in hookup apps, and the fact that they're so common is to me a really fascinating point. So I wanted to ask, do you think there's any relation to be observed between the control individuals exercise over which parts of their bodies they expose in these digital platforms, and a process of intensification or amplification of the erotic effect it might have on the other? Is this idea of choosing to show certain body parts to the detriment of others somehow a gesture of empowerment, possibly a way of having full control over what you want to show and what you don't? Because that really seems to be filled with erotic potential. And also, do you think the phenomena of body part photographs on online apps might in any way mimic the gesture of directing the physical gaze, much the same way as you do in physical cruising encounters on the street, where time might be limited and where the urban environment plays a part in what you get to see and what you don't get to see? If you will, might body part pictures be a sort of deliberate, artistic, and almost poetic gesture by themselves?
I really like that idea that body part pictures are sort of enacting a kind of zooming in that might just be happening anyway, right? Like it's not as if we exist as entirely unmediated when we pass people in the street. I mean, I think that like the word control is really important there, that like so often, I mean, I think one of the things that people are suspicious of about this kind of photographic culture on apps is the sense of curation that might become synonymous with a kind of like either dishonesty of sort of like seeking to amplify something in the name of promoting oneself, like this is my body, this is who I am, or a kind of inflexibility. Like I think of the line from the Denez Smith poem about the headless horse-hung horsemen, that like what these acts are acts of self-objectification in many ways, but there's a sense of agency that comes with that, and a sense of promotion too. I think that they nonetheless are, I guess, where I sort of where I'm like less sure about the sort of poetics of these images is to do with the illusion of the face, I suppose, and like what that, I guess, when we're talking about looking and looking as a form of reciprocity in which both subject and object are kind of implicated, like the illusion of the face, the and the move away from a gaze between people, I think changes the nature of that intimacy, right, in important ways. I mean, of course, Grindr is used as to sort of precipitate a hookup. It's not the thing itself, although many times people use the app for chatting. I mean, that is the act of cruising itself, is the chat rather than the thing that consummates it. But I think in terms of the ways that people might be sort of made accountable to like what cruising is, I think that the body part images, I think, make it so much easier, right? Like the proximity to a marketplace becomes much clearer. So I think that they're not, like, those images are not this like utter contrast to the way that people cruise in person, and therefore should be brought down, and what a terrible kind of cheapening of what intimacy is. Because I mean, also, you go to any gay club and like like the same act of zooming, as you say, of curation would be in play. But I think in terms of what they ask of their viewers, like in terms of the question of the gaze, like that's fundamentally different. Like the poetics of these images is different, and I think like that's also what makes sort of encounters on Grindr often, the stakes feel lower sometimes, right? Like people can hide behind the anonymity of that and almost view these images as images for consumption rather than a kind of shared looking.
Thanks, Jack. So maybe a quick final round of questions before we close. I wanted to, I mean, thinking about this question of zooming in and whatnot, one thing that I think pops up again and again throughout the book is the issue of fetishization and fetishism and whatnot, right? And so for example, in Whitman and O'Hara, you of course see an issue with the way that the Black body, for example, is fetishized, right? But at the same time, in O'Hara's chapter, for example, you also for example, in the way he relates to cinema and exotic locales and whatnot, you seem to, and I may be misunderstanding the argument, but you see an aspect of like a liberating aspect as well in the act of getting away to another place, right, or a different place, a different sort of place, right? And you at some point say, right, there's a passage in the O'Hara chapter in which you say that you're not exonerating O'Hara for fetishizing male bodies, but at the same time you seem to think that there is a positive element to the capacity to fetishize, right, or the aspect of fetishizing something, right? So that seems to be what I took away. Maybe I'm not following the argument there. So maybe if you want to maybe talk a bit about the role of fetishism and what would be.
Sure, I'm certainly not making a case for fetishism, or that I think that the fetishization of is itself positive. I mean for me, my argument is that cruising has a fetishistic capacity, and often, like in many of the literary works that I'm kind of concerned with, or like much of the writing about cruising, we see that in action. That is a problem does not mean that we should totally ignore the aspects of it that can be celebrated, right? And like for me, this continues to be to do with like the tension between what it makes possible and what it, how it often functions in reality and in lived experience. And I think so that's why there's always the kind of like there are sort of two temporalities in play, which is the sort of present moment cruising and what it could yet be, like the kind of promissory of the sort of utopian promises of it. I think like where cinema comes in is really interesting and is very much related to this, that I think like frequently the imaginary of cruising is an imaginary of an elsewhere, like a fantasy of an elsewhere, and the imagination of this person within it. And I think that for me, like it's almost impossible to think of that imaginary capacity without thinking of archetypes, right? That like frequently in the writing like that I'm concerned with, how strangers are imagined and conceptualized has a lot to do with the sort of a pre-existing bank of like cultural material, whether that's Hollywood cinema, whether it's like certain social stereotypes, and those reductions can be violent and racist. You know, like they are not at all neutral projections. But I think like that in a way, I think is why cruising is sort of quite revealing of a sort of sociological aspect of looking per se, right? Because it makes desire kind of naked and visible. Like to read, like it, you know, and I think there's another strain of Ahara's work that is sort of quite romantic about a kind of white working class hustler figure, right? And to sort of read the ways in which he's projecting that onto certain strangers, like is also revealing of what he is consuming as a sort of cultural as a person who is, you know, consuming culture, Hollywood cinema, like other literary works. And I'm thinking of the John Reshi novel City of Night, of the sort of interplay of like magazine covers and actual strangers walking down the streets, that these figures, I think, from, you know, the argument that I make in the book is that from Whitman onwards, one of the things I sort of noticed across these writers is that strangers are sort of often mediated for them through pre-existing representations. And that, I think that always has a kind of fetishistic capacity, right? That you might be kind of elevating or aestheticizing someone, and in doing that, using an over-familiar, like discriminatory set of like stereotypes through which to kind of understand them. And I don't see that as positive. Like, it, you know, I think that and certainly the violence of that, I mean, the risk of fetishization is always negative. I guess I sort of feel fairly value neutral about the fact that that is an aspect of what cruising is. But I think that can mean several things. And I don't think it obscures its kind of utopian potential, right? I think it all depends who is looking and who is being looked at. So there's not a kind of like catch-all answer for that question.
Yeah, just wanted to add that I found this example that you also use in the Langston Hughes chapter of like Walter Evans's pictures, right? And how like he did seem to be in a very safe, you know, defensive position, in the sense that people didn't know that they were that their pictures were being taken, right? And so you point out that is of course questionable, right? That there isn't that element of reciprocity, but I do agree with you, like, I mean, as you now just explained, right, that even that element of fetishizing someone, you're probably being, you know, that involves an element of reciprocity. You're probably getting the same back, right? And so I found this phrase that you used in that chapter, interpersonal nudity, right? That's really, I think, sums up this experience of, in a way, interaction with another person, but also making yourself vulnerable, right? You're of course fetishizing, you're participating in an act of violence, but also you're, you know, it's always compromise, right? You're always involved. Yeah. You're always getting that back. So,
yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, like, that's also an example in which not the Walker Evans, but the question of like an interpersonal nudity, I think, lights upon another strain of what fetishization can mean, which is also to do with the sort of like the erotic thrill of a sense of danger, right, of risk, that I think the feeling of being vulnerable and exposed and potentially at risk is, I think, in a lot of writing about cruising and in the act of cruising, is also eroticized and sort of desirable, like the sense that it might be risky or unpredictable. I think for many, not of course not all people who cruise, like that is part of what it is and what it means.
Elina, do you guys wanna just ask a final round questions?
Yeah, I don't think I really have a further more specific question, since our list of discussion points that was circulated earlier already included a lot of topics that I'd like to hear more about. So I'll let someone else ask something.
I can ask another question. At a certain point, you discuss how apps might be, at least apparently, against the here and now of cruising. And I might be wrong, but I think you actually use the expression the here and now. And that reminded me of the question of the here and now in performance art, the problems that arise with the idea of recording and documenting, and etc. And do you think the discussion we're having today is similar? What I mean is, do you think a certain incapacity to integrate these new apps might be thought in a similar way? Is it possible to think about these questions as a continuum? Because it seems to me that this debate echoes a set of questions that are not strange at all for other artistic expressions over the past century.
When you say the kind of continuum, do you mean what do you mean exactly by the place of the here and now as it relates to performance art? Like the sense that, is this to do with the fact that cruising itself like faces
used to
that
happen in the here and now without
right.
the mediation? That's what I mean.
Yes, right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like partly that's to do with the question of repeatability as well, like the sense that like Roland Barthes writes about cruising as sort of anti-repetition, like the notion that each time is like the first time. And I think that its sort of seriality is something that comes through in a lot of the writing about cruising, is the sense that like each new encounter is given its own set of importance by virtue of being an act of the here and now that then passes and sort of like becomes past tense. And so like something that I think animates a lot of the work about cruising is precisely sort of that conundrum. Like, how do you represent the sort of unrepresentable in terms of a kind of temporality? I suppose what's interesting in relation to the sort of nowness of apps is, one, that they delineate right now, like Grindr delineates right now as a sort of tense. I mean, what does that mean, right? Because it's sort of, it's the now of relation, it's like the now of encounter within an app. Like to be looking for right now, there's like a missing word in that sentence. Like the nowness becomes its own desired object, which I think is just a kind of linguistically very interesting thing about what Grindr does. But also Grindr chats provide an interesting record of these encounters, right? That they exist within this interface in the ways that the verbal is not, that the trace is not left in the same way. So I think apps have a very different relationship to the here and now, precisely because of the way that they function.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jack. I don't know if Vítor has a final question, because I believe I asked his question, or I at least asked a different version of a question that he had prepared. So maybe just, thank you for I don't know, Vítor, do you have a final question, or should I just know? All right. So thank you, Jack. Thank you very much for coming and for the opportunity of engaging a little more in depth with your work, which we all enjoyed, I believe. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much to all of you for engaging with my work. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and it's been very generative to me to think about these questions with you. And yeah, thank you for your time. I really appreciated it.
So bye everyone. See ya. Bye. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.